And for more on the UN Climate Change Report, we're joined now by Tyson Slocum. He's the director of the Public Citizens Energy Program. Tyson, thanks for joining us tonight.
Yep, my pleasure.
So UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon says that the report shows that in order to prevent irreversible damage, massive and urgent action needs to be taken. And to do that, global emissions must fall by at least 40% by 2015 and be cut to zero by the end of the century. Tyson, zero fossil fuels in less than 86 years. Is this an attainable goal? Is this even realistic?
It's not going to be easy, but there's no question that we're seeing a lot of progress in renewables and the role of energy efficiency, particularly in the developed world, in meeting emissions reduction target. This summer, the Obama administration proposed sweeping regulations under the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from existing coal-fired power plants in the United States. And a bulk of that proposal sees attaining emissions reductions by deploying renewables, particularly rooftop solar and utility-scale wind, and aggressive investments in energy efficiency. What we're seeing right now is a revolution in technology where the next 20 years, we're going to see a shift in traditional electric utilities away from the centralized power plant model that's been around for more than 100 years towards a decentralized
system. We are seeing enough technological advances to support this
Right.
goal of zero fossil fuels in 86 years' time.
Well, I think on the electricity sector, it's very attainable. The challenge is going to be in the transportation sector, where the world is still using 90 million barrels of oil every day, and finding a replacement fuel that doesn't emit carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gas emissions,
Right.
but can still move us from point A to point B, that's going to be a big challenge. And that's either going to be, yes.
Tyson, and now the challenge. This report is meant as a roadmap of science, if you will, for the UN climate negotiations, which continue in Peru, ahead of the summit in Paris next year, where a global agreement on climate action is supposed to be adopted. And one of the main issues and challenges has been that there are no real consequences for violating such UN agreements like the Kyoto Protocols, and perhaps even this agreement that will be put together in Paris. So what's the value of this report and in future agreements if there are no real consequences for the violations?
Well, you're correct in that any global agreement has to have enforcement mechanisms, or else it's not going to be very effective.
So how can we enforce this, Tyson?
Well, there's been some legislation in the United States over the last couple of years that say, listen, if a country fails to meet its targets that it agreed to in a global treaty, then countries can assess punitive tariffs on trade, on products that that country seeks to export. So, for example, if China made a pledge to reduce emissions by 30% and failed to do so, then the United States and Europe and other countries could assess punitive tariffs on Chinese exports to those countries. And so that is one way to try and enact some sort of enforcement mechanism in a global climate treaty.
That could indeed open up a whole new can of worms. Now, Tyson, what was interesting, speaking of the economic impact, is that the IPCC says that the cost of actions such as shifting to solar and wind power and other renewable sources would reduce economic growth only by 0.06% annually, 0.06%. That sounds like an underestimation. How could that figure be so low?
Well, it depends. First, we've seen huge efficiencies in transitioning away from centralized coal-fired power plants and into smaller scale distributed generation like rooftop solar and wind. Right now, coal has been established as a primary energy source, chiefly because it historically has been so inexpensive. It is now being eclipsed in many countries, including the United States, by cheaper alternatives. And when you have smaller scale systems where consumers are generating their own power from rooftops or backyards, that's going to provide economic opportunity instead of them sending their money to a centralized utility. So I do think that there are a lot of challenges, but there are huge opportunities in the new energy system. And it just it's all about how it's deployed and whether or not it's going to be deployed in equitable ways.
Tyson, very briefly, what are some of the near-term economic consequences that we're going to see if this isn't resolved?
Well, the near-term consequences are continuing impacts of climate change on vulnerable populations, particularly folks on the coasts and island nations, and also folks in the interior of countries which are affected by droughts and other more severe weathers. So we're going to continue to see increased insurance costs. We're going to see increased problems with agriculture. We're going to see increased damage to storms unless we start taking more aggressive action to sharply reduce emissions. But we have to make sure that we are reducing these emissions in ways that are creating economic opportunity for all populations.
All right. Thank you. Tyson Slocum, Director of Public Citizens Energy Program.